Here we are for our final installment of the mascot matchup competition. It has been a long journey, but we are finally at the matchup to rule them all. I feel like I should be playing Vitamin C's graduation at this point, and as we go on, we will take some time to remember all the times that we had together during this mascot ranking. I mean, we have had some wonderful laughs with some of our mascots. We have been in shock and in awe with some of them, and we've been horrified and disgusted even by some other mascots. But overall, we had fun. And isn't that what it's about? And so today, we are going to finish this up and see between these final mascots who is going to take home the most coveted prize in the Vince Lombardi trophy, but even more coveted, the title of the winner of this year's mascot matchup. And I know looking at the video length, you might be thinking, Sabrina, we have gone in depth on both of these mascots already. How is it possible that you have found the time to yap so much about this final matchup? And if you have that thought, well, you just don't know how high I can fly. Well, without wasting any more time, let's jump right in. And so it'll be a little bit different than our other matchups. Before we would go all in depth on one mascot and then move on to the other mascot. Today we'll be going back and forth, directly comparing the one mascot to the other. But I'll start first with the Kansas City Chiefs and their mascot, KC Wolf. I will put on here his 3Cs rating for our remembrance. And as we might see, KC did horribly on all three of our metrics. He is not cute. It's not clear at all what the heck he is, and it is not creative. All right, so he is horrible right off the bat, but he does make up for it in other areas. So we do see in terms of accolades, he is a multiple time Super Bowler. I mean, this is his third Super Bowl in a row that he's coming to. And so we do see that huge accolade on his part, as well as this mascot just being well seasoned, this being the same mascot since 1990. And so he is prepared. I mean, he is no amateur to this game. He knows what's going on here. And then we have Swoop. So Swoop is also a Super Bowl winning mascot, of course, and he made an appearance recently in the Super Bowl against KC Wolf. This is not a new matchup that we have today, folks. This is a very recent one. So this could be a chance for revenge on Swoop's part, but this could be a chance to really cement for KC Wolf his dominance, potentially. We'll see. So for Swoop, we do see again, so he's been in Super Bowls himself, that he's at least been in one Pro Bowl, not as clear. He also made his debut as an actor. Like, there's some great accolades on Swoop's part here. But this is where we will jump into the history. Now, in past, when we would go to the history, we said that we do this because the history, of course, plays a big role in our present. If we don't focus on the history, we are doomed to repeat it. It shapes who we are. And so we want to look at the history, but we won't go into the history of the mascots. We've already done that. But history in terms of their past matchup. Who have the teams and the mascots played this year, this season, in general, and then who have they played throughout the playoffs? So looking at this season, I mean, both of these teams have very few losses. That's how they got to such a high state, right? That we see that Kansas City only has 2 and the Eagles only have 3 losses. So let's start with Kansas City and look at the matchups and, of course, the mascots that were a part of those matchups, the mascots that beat KC Wolf. Now, one of them we're kind of going to disqualify. This was the Denver Broncos. This was the very last game of the regular season. The Kansas City Chiefs had already secured their bye. They didn't start any of their starters. I mean, they scored 0 points. So this is meaningless. I mean, the mascots can show up, but it is ultimately, at the end of the day, a team. So if the players decide not to play, there's nothing the mascot can really do. And so we have to disqualify this because of what time this came in the season. So looking at the one loss that we see, that Kansas City, their one loss came to the Buffalo Bills in November. So bringing back William, aka Billy the Buffalo. Now, if we remember for our video on Billy, he doesn't really have any accolades. He hasn't been to any Pro Bowls. He hasn't been to the Super Bowl. I mean, there's really nothing to speak of. But as you might recall, remember the experts in our USA Today ranking, they rated him all the way up at number 1, above almost 30 other mascots that we see. So that is a pretty strong ranking that we see, but not a whole lot of accolades. So likely what happened at this point is that KC Wolf might have underestimated Billy the Buffalo and how difficult of a competition he might be. We do see that later on, in order to get to this Super Bowl, that KC Wolf did get his lick back and ended up beating Billy the Buffalo. And so again, it's likely that he might have underestimated Billy in the forefront. But let's look at Swoop and see the mascots that he had lost to throughout the season. So like I mentioned, the Philadelphia Eagles, they lost 3 games this season to the Washington Commanders, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Atlanta Falcons. So with these mascots, we have Freddie the Falcon of the Atlanta Falcons. We have Captain Fear of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And then, of course, how could we forget Major Tuddy, our dear Major Tuddy of the Washington Commanders? And so just looking at all these mascots, these 3 right away, what we see is all these mascots are kind of crazy, kooky, they're off in some way, right? Like, look at this falcon. There is something not right about how this bird looks. I mean, we already know what Major Tuddy is hiding under that helmet, and Captain Fear also is kind of giving similar vibes as Major Tuddy. He likely as well was in a fraternity in college, might have just been in a rival fraternity of Major Tuddy, the one that Major Tuddy would have been in. But in general, there's something kind of unstable about these mascots. Something ain't right. And it seems like that might be Swoop's kryptonite. Throughout the season, the Philadelphia Eagles, they played mostly against teams that either didn't have a quarterback at all, so for instance, Green Bay or the New York Giants, and or more stable, normal mascots. So mascots like Rampage, for instance, or Poe. The only other 2 games this season that they won, in which they played against more off and just kind of downright psychotic mascots, came with the games against the New Orleans Saints and the Cleveland Browns. And so going first with the New Orleans Saints. This is both of them have 2 mascots for some reason. These are the Saints. I don't even have words. Lock them up. What is the chin? What is the It's horrendous. And what we see from the score is this game was very close. They only won by 3 points. That is a very small margin of victory. And then next to the Cleveland Browns, same thing, 2 mascots. They love the extra dog in there. I don't know. Why is their mascot the Keebler Elf, but the Keebler Elf in like his 90s, which is a saggy face? And with this game versus the Cleveland Browns, what we see is that they only won by 4 points. Now, for the games that the Philadelphia Eagles won this season, these 2 were the closest margin. There was 2 other games that they played this season in which they won by 5 points, but as we know, 5 is more than 4. And so these 2 games were the lowest scoring winning games that they had. And what we see is that they also had 2 very weird, very strange mascots. And so it seems like that is Swoop's kryptonite. And this does not bode well for Swoop in this matchup because, as we know, KC is the king of all the creepy, weird, scary, just not right mascots, right? And that could have been a factor, maybe the more recent Super Bowl we saw, which at that point was more focused on the Kelceys. The Kelsey Bowl, the mascots weren't as big of a feature, but it could have been similar in that Swoop was, that's his kryptonite. And so he's going up again against KC Wolf, who hasn't gotten any less weird than he's been. And so this is a point in KC Wolf's bucket for sure. We have to take this in consideration. Now, what about the playoffs themselves? So we kind of want to see the teams, more importantly, the mascots that they had beat throughout the season. So we'll start again with Kansas City and with KC Wolf. So Kansas City, they got the bye, so they only played 2 playoff games in which they matched up against Toro, the Texan, and Billy, the Buffalo. And so with Toro, our dear Toro, who was robbed, really felt that he should have won his matchup, but here we are today. I mean, Toro was a formidable opponent, that he was the mascot of the year in 2021, that he is an 11-time Pro Bowler. From my research, it seems the most decorated mascot in terms of Pro Bowl that we have, and he is just lovable. And so that is very, very formidable opponent. We've talked already about Billy, not really that many accolades, so not as formidable of an opponent, but he did lose earlier in the season. So to get his revenge back says something. So that's a strong win for KC Wolf in terms of beating Toro the Texan. Now let's move to Swoop and see his matchup. So they did not get the first round bye, so they have played 3 teams and 3 mascots. And so the mascots that they went up against were Major Tuddy. Again, he is haunting us. He will not leave us. So Major Tuddy, Rampage, our dear Rampage, also one of my favorites. And then Green Bay, who, as we know, didn't even have a mascot. So you can throw Green Bay out because Swoop didn't even play against anybody that game. And then with Major Tuddy, I mean, him being much newer, he didn't really have any accolades. Looking more into it, I did see that in 2023, he was voted to the Pro Bowl, so he's at least been to one Pro Bowl, but not huge accolades on that part. So really his main competition would have been Rampage. And when we look at Rampage, he had pretty great accolades too. I believe he was a seven-time Pro Bowler that he had so much in the uniqueness points. This is a very strong mascot as well. So two very strong, formidable opponents that they had, and both of them being great wins. But what we do see is that Rampage, also a great, highly decorated mascot, that the Eagles did win, but there was some concern there at the end. I mean, Rampage, for all intents and purposes, really still should have won that matchup. It's unfortunately his team and the rest of the LA Rams who clearly did not want the win as much that they let it go in the last few seconds. And so, although it is a strong win, we do see a little bit of struggle there for Swoop that's not seen as much for KC Wolf, but they still won. A win's a win at the end of the day, right? But returning to the accolades, I mean, who is going to edge the other out? Who is really going to come out on top? What we see from Casey Wolf, if we'll remember, in 2022, he was voted the worst mascot of the year by NFL fans. And you know what he did? He turned around and won himself a Super Bowl that very next year. Yup, beating our dear, sorry, Swoop, but beating the dear Swoop to do it. And so he thrives off the hate, specifically from NFL fans, because even last year, there was a lot of issue, a lot of hate as well due to, Taylor Swift. People were tired of her. They didn't want to see her, and people just being tired of the Chiefs. And so he really thrives off of this. It only makes him stronger. He is going for the three-peat right now. And as we know, if that's what makes him stronger, he is in a perfect position right now because nobody except Kansas City fans wants Kansas City to win this game. Everybody is against them. And so if that makes them stronger, gosh, they're in a good place to be. And as we might remember from the uniqueness point of KC Wolf is that he almost died in GHA, however the heck you say the Kansas City Stadium. He almost died in that stadium, falling from 75 feet into the stands. He left his blood, his sweat, his tears in that stadium, just like the players do, game in and game out. And I think that experience really showed him what it was like to sacrifice, put himself on the line to be a Kansas City Chief like his other teammates do every single day, every single game. And Swoop just doesn't quite have that. Swoop doesn't have these near-death experiences. He might not have had to fight really to be the mascot for the Philadelphia Eagles. But now going to Swoop, we talked about KC winning the Super Bowl off the back of being just hated by so many people. But what about Swoop? Now, he won the Super Bowl at a time where he was considered an underdog. I mean, their starting quarterback was out. They had this rando out there trying to win them a freaking Super Bowl. I mean, nobody expected them to win. They were an underdog, but they didn't have the love and support of a whole nation like they do now. Thinking of their more recent playoff game versus the Commanders, nobody except mostly the Eagles fans wanted the Eagles to win that matchup. From what I was seeing, everybody really wanted Washington Commanders. If they knew about Major Tuddy's dark secret, they probably wouldn't, but most people wanted the Commanders to win that game. And so, what did the Eagles do? They absolutely ravished the Commanders. I mean, the fans didn't want them to win, and look at where they are now. And so now that the tide has turned and everybody wants them to beat the Chiefs, how are they going to perform? Because we've seen, almost like KC, very similarly, they seem to do better when people are against them, when the odds are against them. And so that brings me into what they need to do to win. Now, if you've watched enough of these sports analysis on TV, you'll often see the commentators talking about what a team has to do to win this matchup. When we think about the actual team themselves, we might know what they have to do. For instance, Kansas City, they need to control the run and they need to stop the dual threat in Jalen Hurts. They need to stop the run pass option. What the Eagles have to do is they have to get to the quarterback. They cannot allow Mahomes to dance around out there and create some plays and throw this crazy pass for a touchdown that shouldn't have even been possible to complete, right? But again, we're not here to talk about the team. We know what they have to do, but what do the mascots have to do? And in particular, what does Swoop need to do? Because in this case, he is the one who's more of an underdog. KC just kind of needs to keep doing his thing, but what does Swoop need to do to make it convincing? So to go back to what I just said about winning the Super Bowl, which reminder, Swoop was at, they have to channel that hated team energy, not just the underdog energy, but they need to lock in with their team and act as if everybody else is against them. When I was doing some of my research, I looked into bald eagles, and they are typically a solitary animal. We know Swoop is a bald eagle. typically a solitary animal, but when they hunt in packs, they can be powerful. They do a lot of tactics such as one eagle swooping down, flushing out their prey, and then the other coming in for the kill. And so for this game, Swoop needs to hunt with his pack. He cannot be solitary. He needs to lock in with his teammates, and they need to get the win together. Now, when I say that, though, there's an aspect of that I don't really like because, as we know, this is the mascot matchup. And we need to see, can the mascot stand alone on their own 2 feet? So we know that Swoop would be stronger with his pack, but how would he do solitary? Currently, it's not boding well for Swoop, but there's another metric that might push him ahead. And so this is going to be somewhat different than what we've done before, too. We're going to bring in 2 other metrics here, and I'll make my decision at the end. Now, our regular metric that we'll often throw in just for fun is the hottest QB. This one can have an impact on the tide of the game today. And so for this hottest QB matchup, we have our third and final light skin battle of the playoffs, which features Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes. And both of these men were in the first and second light skin matchups that we saw of the playoff as well. Jalen Hurts going up against Jordan Love, and then Patrick Mahomes going up against CJ Stroud. And what we saw is that Jalen won his matchup. And let's be honest, because we know I am never, let's be clear, never going to vote Patrick Mahomes as a hot quarterback. If I do, lock me up in the psych ward, something is not right. And so obviously he's going to win this matchup too. And so we have Jalen winning 2 of the light skin battles, both of the ones he was in, and Mahomes losing both of his. But this gets even worse when we think about the fact that Jordan Love, who Jalen Hurts beat, was pretty formidable opponent in that matchup. But then Mahomes, who he lost to prior to this, was CJ Stroud, who, as I mentioned, I had to pick. I was constrained. I did not have a choice. I was held hostage and had to pick a hottest QB between the two. For me, CJ Stroud is just one step above Patrick Mahomes in terms of hotness. So this is not a formidable matchup at all. And so this actually can play a role because what I just said, Swoop needs to hunt with his pack. He cannot really, it seems like, he cannot do this game alone today. So with the hotness of Jalen right now, he is arguably one of the hottest quarterbacks in the NFL. I mean, he is definitely top 3, and he's beat some good quarterbacks in his matchup leading up to this point. And so coupled together, Swoop, with the hotness of his quarterback, if they lock in together as a team, they could beat and overwhelm the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, it's unclear at this point how locked in they are together. I'm seeing a lot of press conferences, a lot of talks between other teammates that aren't the mascots, a lot of talk of, Saquon Barkley this, AJ Smith that, where's Swoop in all this, right? And so, we're unsure if he's at that stage, but could be something that can lift Swoop and the Eagles above the Kansas City Chiefs and KC Wolf. But let's go into another metric. This one could also potentially play in either of the mascots' favor, and that is the Super Bowl halftime show. Now, we know that momentum shifts and in general hype can really impact and change a game. I mean, momentum shifts are behind huge comebacks that people have, behind, maybe winning certain games. Momentum and the hype is key. And a big thing that can create that is the music, right? That's why the pre-game music, that playlist is so important and so sacred. You pick your songs on that playlist with a level of care and attention that you need to make sure that it helps you when it comes time to perform. And so, with the Super Bowl performance being at halftime, it could be that this helped push the mascots to give them that hype and make a shift in momentum in the third quarter. And I know you might be thinking, okay, this potentially could be a little bit of a reach. Well, let's go back in the past. Let's go back to the only other game this season that really had a big halftime show, which is, of course, the Beyonce Bowl on Christmas. Now, what we might remember when I discussed this with the Baltimore Ravens is that on Christmas, they played the Houston Texans in Houston, and Lamar very excitedly say, at halftime, sorry, coach, I am going out there. Like, I'm not missing the show. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't care. I will risk it all, which, again, we love that energy from Lamar. And what we see, if we look at this from the score from that game, in the third quarter, the Ravens scored the most points that they had scored that whole game, right after the halftime show happened. Now, coincidence? I think not. And so, in a similar way that this helped the Ravens to really push them in that third quarter, this can do the same for our mascots today. Now, for this year's halftime show, we have Compton's very own, Drake's worst nightmare, Mr. K. Kendrick Lamar. I mean, it is going to be undoubtedly an amazing show, right? That's a big reason that we are all watching, is just to see how much Kendrick can continue to obliterate Drake on a large scale, because he is doing well so far. And so, which of our mascots would have Drake in their pregame pump up playlist? Let's start with Casey Wolf. Definitely not him, right? He is way too goofy. He's not playing Kendrick to hype himself up. Now, I don't think he in particular hates Kendrick. If we remember, he did, go to Africa to speak to some kids. So he might be, down with the people, right? And so I don't think he hates Kendrick, but I think he doesn't like him either, right? He'll allow it to play if it's playing, but at some point, if you keep going a couple songs in a row, he might be like, "Oh, can we listen to something else?" And so this isn't going to help Casey, but it's not going to harm his performance either. I think in the third quarter, he's going to be pretty stable. This isn't going to give him necessarily a boost. So let's go to Swoop. Now, right off the bat, my initial thought was to just say, duh, of course Swoop is a Beyonce fan. I mean, he comes from Philly. Who else is from Philly? Meek Mill. So, of course, he is big in the rap game and he's going to be a fan of Kendrick, right? But then I had flashbacks to our other mascot matchups where I said, but I have a concern with that. Is Swoop a Trump supporter, right? I mean, just look at the outfit. The patriotism, the bald eagle of it all, it's giving a little bit Republican, right? The worry about Swoop potentially being a Trump supporter. And, while it's impossible at this stage and maybe illegal to see his ballot to see if he did check Harris Waltz, we are left to speculate on what political party he does support. And so let's say, if he wasn't a Trump supporter, absolutely, he would be a huge Kendrick fan. I mean, I can't see him not being. But if he is, do we think he'd want to hear Kendrick say, all I ever wanted was a black Grand National? Personally, I don't. Do we think he'd want to hear Kendrick say, oh, and we hate Popo, want to kill us dead in the street for show? I personally can't see that. And so if he is a Trump supporter, I think he would actively hate Kendrick Lamar. And so the halftime show would in turn cause him to play even worse in the third quarter. So what we see is that it could either be really huge and boost for Swoop or really bad and bring him down. I think the third quarter, what we're going to see from the Eagles in general is not going to be a stable, steady performance. Either it's going to be much worse than the other quarters, which would tell us all that we need to know, or it's going to be much better. But is that surge, the potential surge in the third quarter, is that enough to beat Casey Wolf? Now, at this point, I just don't know. What we've seen, this matchup happened recently, and I haven't seen much from Swoop since then to indicate that now, as opposed to last time, that he can take over and beat Casey Wolf. I mean, at least in that game, they had the power of, it was the Kelsey Bowl. They had the power of Jason Kelsey behind them. But this game, what do they have? You could argue Saquon Barkley, but, is that enough? And so for the Super Bowl, I am going to have to advise that you all do not wear your contacts. You all wear your glasses for this game, because when you roll your eyes to the back of your head, seeing the unseasoned and out of tempo Casey fan swag surfing to another Super Bowl, I don't want those contacts to be stuck in the back of your head. That's right. Unfortunately, for this round, and I do say unfortunately with a heavy heart, it is that I have to choose the Kansas City Chiefs and Casey Wolf to take this and win this all. This is not what I wanted to see. I didn't even want Casey Wolf to be here. But I have to be objective and I have to look at what I'm given in front of me, and that is just what I'm seeing, folks. And so, maybe next year they were going for the coveted three-peat. Hopefully after this point, they kind of just fall off and we get some other mascots in the spotlight next year. But in terms of our 2024-2025 season, that's all, folks. That's a wrap. So we'll just have to see how it unfolds on game day and see if Swoop proves us wrong and wins that trophy.